They placed 12 pages before him, pages not signed, not owned, not even breathed by his people. An apology crafted in foreign capitals, an instruction to kneel, a script meant to silence. They said, read this, survive, remain a partner. But when Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the hall of the United Nations, he did not carry their words. He carried the unbroken voice of a continent that has been told to bow for 400 years. This is the paradox of our time. A small landlocked nation is treated as fragile, yet it becomes unshakable when dignity is at stake. Traoré did not come to confess. He came to question. He did not come to apologize. He came to remind the world that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Stay with us. This is not a headline. This is a hinge in history. Subscribe and walk with the story, for what follows may alter how we read the map of power. Because the question now is simple yet immense. If one man refuses the script of surrender, what happens when a continent decides it too will not kneel? They called it diplomacy, but it looked more like shackles written in ink. After his fiery remarks at the United Nations 2 months earlier, remarks that dared to draw a line between the cries of Palestinian mothers and the cries of mothers in Mali, Niger, and Congo, the machinery of global order moved against Ibrahim Traoré. Letters arrived from New York, not to open dialogue, but to demand correction. In them, the word clarification masked the intent of confession. In Ouagadougou, phone lines burned with foreign voices. Paris whispered of lost partnerships. Washington hinted at sanctions. Tel Aviv signaled its displeasure in language sharpened by decades of conflict. Outwardly, it looked like diplomacy. In truth, it was pressure. Pressure designed to teach a lesson. Speak too boldly, and Africa will be reminded of its place. Then came the draft. 12 pages divided into neat sections. 4 pages asking forgiveness for tone. 3 pages apologizing for language. 5 pages reaffirming shared values. Yet whose values were these? The values that excused silence in the face of bombed schools, exploited minds, and stolen futures? Traoré read the draft, folded it once, and placed it aside. It was not a question of grammar, but of sovereignty. Behind closed doors, the pressure deepened. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a black SUV without diplomatic plates arrived at the presidential palace. From it stepped Ambassador Richardson of the United States, flanked by 2 silent men who never introduced themselves. He came not with greetings, but with threats dressed as intelligence. Satellite photographs of Burkina Faso's gold mines, contracts inked with Chinese engineers, agricultural ventures guided by Russian expertise. We know everything, he said quietly, and we can call it cooperation, or we can call it something else. The implication was clear: align with Western instructions or face exposure, sanctions, and isolation. Yet Traoré was unmoved. Tell me, Ambassador, he asked, did your country apologize before invading Iraq? Did France apologize before intervening in Mali? Did Israel apologize before striking Gaza? The silence that followed was answer enough. But resistance, he knew, required strategy as well as courage. False signals were planted across surveillance channels. Rumors were leaked to the press that he was reconsidering. Headlines in CNN and the BBC declared that Burkina Faso's leader might soften his stance. In Washington, relief spread through offices. They believed the pressure campaign was working. On the ground, however, a very different story was unfolding. In Revolution Square, more than 50,000 Burkinabe gathered to hear their president. They listened not to an apology, but to a promise. They think we will beg for permission to speak. They think we will apologize for defending our dignity. But when I stand in New York, I will not speak for one nation alone. I will speak for every African told to be grateful for crumbs. The roar that followed could be heard for miles. By then, the confrontation had outgrown the pages of a scripted apology. It had become a test of whether Africa's voice could be silenced yet again, or whether at last the soil would give birth to its own harvest of freedom. But the real stage was not Revolution Square, nor the backrooms of Ouagadougou. The real stage was waiting in New York, under the lights of the General Assembly. And when Ibrahim Traoré finally walked into that chamber, the world learned that silence was no longer an option. The air inside the chamber was heavy, as if every seat carried the weight of centuries. Delegates from more than 100 nations shuffled their papers, whispered behind nameplates, or smirked as the young president of Burkina Faso adjusted the microphone. Some expected hesitation. Others expected submission. What they did not expect was a reversal, a storm unleashed in sentences sharp as blades and pauses heavy as thunder. I have been told to apologize, Traoré began. But let me ask you, How many times have you apologized for what you have done to Africa? The question cracked through the assembly like a whip. No one replied. He pressed further. Did Belgium ever apologize for the Congo? Did France ever apologize for Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilize our region? Cameras zoomed in on shifting faces. Some delegates lowered their eyes. The speech became a litany, a catalog of double standards. You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth. But when bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When thousands of African children starve under your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic. Each phrase drew from the soil of history. Each pause planted a seed of defiance. Then came the moment that none had anticipated. From his pocket, Traoré pulled a mobile phone. This morning, he said, a 12-year-old girl from Ouagadougou sent me a message. She wrote, Mr. President, my teacher says you are going to America to speak for us. Please do not let them make you small. He looked up. That child has more dignity than this entire assembly. The silence that followed was not indifference, it was discomfort and unmasking. He leaned forward. I will apologize for one thing only. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to stand here without fear. I apologize that our children grew up believing dignity required Western approval. I apologize that we ever mistook partnership for subordination. Pens froze. Translators hesitated. Even the note-takers stopped writing. But then his tone hardened. I will not apologize for rejecting occupation disguised as diplomacy. I will not apologize for refusing partnerships that keep my people in poverty. I will not apologize for being African and proud. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then at last you understand how we have felt for centuries. At that, the French delegate rose and walked out. Traoré did not flinch. He let him leave, as if to prove the point. This was not a plea. It was a reckoning. The effect was immediate. 3 hours after his final words, the African Union called an emergency session. 43 ambassadors met not to discuss aid, nor to draft loan conditions, but to debate sovereignty. By midnight, they had crafted the New York Declaration, a commitment that no African state would accept conditional aid, apologize for defending dignity, or allow foreign dictates to shape domestic choices. Within 48 hours, 12 presidents signed it. Outside the halls of diplomacy, the streets vibrated. In Nairobi, students declared a Dignity Day. In Lagos, market women refused to sell products linked to settlements in Palestine. In Accra, musicians sampled lines from the speech. In Cape Town, murals appeared showing a chain unbroken, from Nkrumah to Mandela to Traoré. For a continent long told that its voice mattered only in whispers, this was not just a speech, it was a spark. And sparks, when caught by the wind of frustration and hope, do not simply fade, they ignite. They thought he had played his last card at the podium. But in truth, the most unsettling consequences were only beginning to unfold. The morning after the United Nations speech, the headlines screamed in disbelief. Burkina Faso's president defies the West. Traoré refuses to apologize. African leader stuns global diplomats. Western media scrambled to frame it. Some called him reckless, others labeled him dangerous. A few dared to call him courageous. But for the people of Africa, the message was simple. Silence had finally been broken. In Brussels, the European Union moved swiftly, freezing $27 million in development funds. In Washington, the IMF postponed its scheduled debt relief review for Burkina Faso. French outlets launched smear campaigns, branding Traoré a dictator in disguise. One American think tank warned, Burkina Faso risks isolation unless its leader learns the art of diplomacy. But what they called isolation, the streets of Ouagadougou called independence. Revolution Square filled once more, not with chants of anger, but with offers of labor. Farmers came with tools, students came with notebooks, engineers came with blueprints. They declared that if the world turned its back, they would build with their own hands. A grandmother was filmed saying on national television, I am not educated, but today I am proud to be Burkinabe. Her words traveled faster than any diplomatic communique. The ripple spread outward. In Lagos, women traders turned away European middlemen offering unfair prices. In Accra, university students cornered foreign mining executives and demanded transparency and profits. In Nairobi, young activists held teach-ins about sovereignty, declaring that foreign aid was not generosity, but dependency repackaged. In Cape Town, a teenage girl stood before the gates of an apartheid museum and said to her phone camera, "We are done apologizing, not for being African, not for demanding respect, not for knowing our worth." Her video reached 13 million viewers in 2 days. These were not isolated gestures. They were signals of a shift, a psychological emancipation that no sanction could undo. For decades, Africans had been told that dignity was conditional, tied to the signatures of donors or the nods of international creditors. But after the speech, millions discovered that dignity required no permission. Inside Burkina Faso, the change was even more tangible. Local cooperatives formed spontaneously, repairing irrigation channels abandoned by foreign contractors. Diaspora communities pooled money to fund technology labs in Ouagadougou. Volunteers rebuilt schools, refusing outside grants. For the first time in living memory, a narrative of self-reliance began to take root, not as state propaganda, but as lived experience. Of course, the costs were real. Prices of imported goods rose. Foreign investors delayed projects. Opposition voices warned of economic collapse. But the people seemed to accept the hardship as a price worth paying. They had tasted something more valuable than subsidy, sovereignty. Observers called it reckless. Yet to many Africans, it looked like a revolution. Not of guns and barricades, but of mindset and courage. One phrase repeated across social media captured it best. We are not children to be managed. We are nations choosing to be free. It was at this moment that the story of Burkina Faso was no longer about one man. It was about an entire people stepping into the unknown, guided not by guarantees of comfort, but by the conviction that dignity was non-negotiable. And somewhere in Washington, a classified memo would later admit what diplomats dared not say aloud. The speech had created a precedent. If Ibrahim Traoré could stand unyielding, then others might follow. And if one apology could be refused, then every future attempt at forced contrition risked rejection too. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a contagion. In diplomatic cables leaked weeks later, Western officials began referring nervously to what they called the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not the military takeover that had brought him to power, but the coup of dignity he staged at the United Nations, undermining decades of scripted submission. But what unsettled Western capitals most was not the loss of aid leverage or contracts. It was the realization that the echo of one voice had awakened a chorus across a continent. The aftershocks of Traoré's words did not remain confined to Ouagadougou. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency summit. The conversations were no longer about donor packages or external debt forgiveness, but about sovereignty. For the first time in decades, African ambassadors drafted a joint declaration refusing conditional aid and foreign dictates. This New York declaration marked a symbolic rupture with the logic of dependency. ECOWAS, long criticized for following the lead of Western capitals, found itself divided. Some member states feared economic punishment. Others whispered that the speech had given voice to what they had privately thought for years. That partnership with the West was never equal, only conditional. The European Union reacted with predictable severity. Aid was suspended, projects halted, and op-eds denounced Traoré as reckless. Yet beneath the condemnations lay an unmistakable nervousness. If one of the poorest nations in Africa could stand unbowed, what message did that send to Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt? The United States balanced threats with caution. Publicly, officials warned that Burkina Faso risked isolation. Privately, leaked memos revealed an anxious recognition. If the Burkina model spread, Washington's leverage in sub-Saharan Africa would erode within 5 years. In think tanks and foreign ministries, analysts debated whether sanctions would harden resistance rather than weaken it, and then unexpectedly the Caribbean moved. Within a week, Haiti withdrew from World Bank's structural adjustment programs. Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Dominican Republic soon followed. Leaders from Kingston to Port-au-Prince invoked Traoré's words, saying Africa had given them permission to remember their own dignity. This was no longer just an African debate. It was becoming a global vocabulary of resistance. Even beyond the Black Atlantic, ripples appeared. Indigenous groups in the Americas cited the speech in land rights campaigns. Aboriginal leaders in Australia referenced it in sovereignty movements. Pacific Island nations began framing their climate demands in the same uncompromising language. The refusal to apologize had escaped the walls of the UN and entered the bloodstream of global politics. Commentators began to describe the movement as the Burkina Faso Revolution, not of violence, but of voice, proof that even a small state could redefine dignity on the world stage. For Western powers accustomed to controlling the narrative, this was alarming. For Africans long denied the microphone, it was liberating. Yet even as global attention grew, one question remained unanswered. What would the future hold for Burkina Faso itself? In Ouagadougou, the echoes of that UN speech had not faded. They had been planted like seeds. The question on every lip was no longer whether Africa could stand without apology, but how it would walk the road ahead. For Burkina Faso, the future stretched in two directions, one lined with sanctions and isolation, the other with self-reliance and solidarity. The risks were undeniable. Development funds had been frozen. Trade negotiations grew tense. Foreign investors hesitated. Every step forward would come with obstacles designed to remind the nation of its vulnerability. But something had shifted. The people no longer measured progress in donor promises. They measured it in dignity. Already new experiments were underway. Farmers applied ancestral techniques once dismissed as primitive, only to discover harvest doubling. Universities launched engineering programs funded by diaspora contributions rather than foreign NGOs. Local cooperatives took control of irrigation systems long abandoned by outside contractors. These were not grand gestures staged for cameras, but daily acts of sovereignty woven into the ordinary lives of citizens. On the continental stage, the example was contagious. In Zambia, leaders began to renegotiate copper contracts. In Tanzania, presidents demanded that a greater share of mining profits remain within national borders. In Senegal, debates erupted about the future of French military bases. One refusal in New York had encouraged dozens of reevaluations across Africa. But perhaps the greatest opportunity lay in unity. For decades, the African Continental Free Trade Area had stalled in bureaucracy. Suddenly, citizens were demanding it. Entrepreneurs wanted African markets for African goods. Youth activists called for an economic revolution to match the political awakening. What leaders had struggled to negotiate, the people were now demanding in the streets. Still, the path ahead was uncertain. Retaliation from the West would be harsh, perhaps harsher than anyone expected. There would be campaigns to discredit, sanctions to punish, and attempts to divide. Yet for many Burkinabe, this was no longer a deterrent. What they called isolation, Traoré reframed as independence. The metaphor of the soil carried through his message. No foreign hand could sow seeds of freedom. Only Africans themselves could tend the ground and reap the harvest. The question now was whether that harvest would be shared, whether this moment would remain a spark or grow into a season of renewal. And as the nation stood at this crossroads, one truth lingered in the air. Dignity had been chosen, but would Africa have the courage to walk the long road it demanded? The flag placed in his hand by an old freedom fighter in Ouagadougou was more than fabric. It was memory stitched with sacrifice, a reminder that freedom is never gifted, only chosen. When Ibrahim Traoré returned from New York, he understood that the speech at the United Nations had not ended a chapter. It had opened one. In that hall of marble and microphones, he had refused the role of contrite pupil. He had stood as a messenger of dignity. And in doing so, he turned a moment of confrontation into a movement of awakening. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Accra to Cape Town, the refrain grew louder. No apology, no surrender, no more silence. Western capitals called it defiance. African streets called it pride. And while sanctions bit and media smears multiplied, something stronger than fear was taking root. For the first time in generations, millions felt permitted to believe that sovereignty was not a dream, but a decision. This is why diplomats whispered about the Ibrahim Traoré coup, not the seizure of power by arms, but the coup of dignity staged in full view of the world. It was repeated again in memos and analyses, as if naming it might contain it. Yet the more they tried to define it, the more it spread, reshaping the political imagination of a continent. Commentators abroad began to call it the Burkina Faso Revolution, though it was not marked by violence but by voice, not by barricades but by belief. It was a revolution of self-worth, of nations daring to demand respect without compromise. And it was a reminder that the most dangerous act in the eyes of empires is not defiance with weapons, but defiance with truth. As the sun sets on each day in Burkina Faso, farmers till the soil not as dependents, but as stewards. Students fill classrooms not to mimic foreign models, but to shape their own. And elders tell the young that dignity, once chosen, must be guarded every day. Stay with us, because this is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of an Africa that refuses to apologize for its existence. Subscribe, share, and add your voice to the chorus of freedom. For history will not remember this moment as the day Traoré bowed. It will remember it as the day Africa stood tall, and the Ibrahim Traoré coup became the seed of a Burkina Faso revolution that the world could no longer ignore.